57 giant trucks stopped dead at the border. Soldiers surrounded them. Journalists scrambled for answers, and one man stood in their way, Captain Ibrahim Traore. Some said those trucks carried food, others whispered about weapons, and a few even believed it was something far more dangerous. But here's the real question. What were they really carrying? Stay with me, because the truth behind these 57 trucks might shock you. 57 massive trucks, engines rumbling in the heat, drivers leaning out of their windows, sweat dripping down their foreheads, soldiers with rifles at the ready, standing firm like statues, and in front of it all, one man, a young soldier. Turned leader, Captain Ibrahim Traore, blocked the path with nothing but his command. This was more than a checkpoint or border delay. It was a confrontation fit for a political thriller, a line of giant trucks stretching to the horizon, cargo hidden under dusty tarps. Some said it was food aid for Burkina Faso. Others whispered darker suspicions. Traoré stood between these narratives, defiant against the convoy, demanding a halt. The tension was electric. Local villagers gathered near the border, craning their necks to catch a glimpse. Journalists rushed to the scene, their cameras clicking, their microphones outstretched, desperate to capture history in the making. On social media, rumors spread like wildfire. Why was the young captain stopping so many trucks? What did he suspect? And most importantly, what were these trucks really carrying? Traoré had ordered his soldiers to surround the convoy. Their boots pounded the dusty ground in unison, a clear show of discipline and loyalty. Nobody was allowed to pass. Nobody. Not even the drivers, who were restless, angry, and confused. Some honked their horns in protest, the sound echoing across the border. Others stepped out of their cabs, pleading with soldiers to let them go. But the answer was always the same: orders from Captain Traoré. This moment mattered because cross-border convoys are a daily occurrence in Africa, usually unquestioned. Goods arrive, leave, sometimes benefiting outsiders more than locals. But Traoré insisted on knowing exactly what entered his country. His decision to question the unknown rang alarm bells in Burkina Faso and the region. Eyewitnesses described the scene as almost surreal. One villager told reporters, "I've never seen anything like it. 57 trucks lined up, and one young man refused to bow to pressure. It was like David against Goliath." That imagery stuck. Online, people began calling Traoré the David of Burkina Faso, standing against forces much bigger and more powerful than himself. But while the symbolism was inspiring, the practical reality was tense. Every hour, those trucks sat idle. The drivers grew more impatient, and the questions grew louder. Was Traoré blocking vital humanitarian aid meant to feed hungry families, or was he uncovering a secret shipment of weapons designed to destabilize the country? Both possibilities carried enormous weight. Timing made this even more striking. Burkina Faso has been under persistent pressure, political, economic, and military. The country faces terrorist insurgencies, shortages, and foreign interference. Since 2022, Traoré has taken a firm stand against corruption and exploitation. For many, this standoff wasn't about trucks. It represented sovereignty and the right to self-determination. As the hours dragged on, international media picked up the story. Headlines flashed across the world. Burkina Faso blocks 57 trucks at border. Analysts debated on television. Was this a bold act of patriotism or a reckless gamble that could cost lives? On Twitter, hashtag supporting Traoré trended, with users posting memes of trucks versus one captain. At the same time, critics accused him of grandstanding, arguing that he was turning a routine shipment into a political spectacle. But Traoré wasn't listening to the noise. Standing under the scorching sun, he remained calm, his arms folded, his gaze fixed firmly on the line of trucks. Soldiers looked to him for direction, and he gave only one order: "No one passes until we know the truth." And that right there is what makes this story so gripping. It wasn't about the physical cargo inside those trucks. It was about the symbolic cargo they carried. Were they carrying exploitation disguised as aid, or hope disguised as suspicion? By halting them, Traoré forced the world to confront a bigger question. Who really benefits from what crosses African borders every day? The longer the trucks stood still, the bigger the mystery grew. Villagers whispered about hidden gold, stolen resources, even foreign weapons meant for mercenaries. The drivers avoided eye contact, some nervously smoking cigarettes, others pacing the dirt road. Everyone was waiting for answers, for confrontation, for revelation. And as the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the convoy, one thing became clear. This was no ordinary standoff. This was the beginning of a story that would test the resolve of a leader, the patience of a nation, and the hidden interests of powerful players far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. To understand why that border standoff electrified an entire continent, we must understand the man at the center of it, Captain Ibrahim Traore. He isn't just another military officer. He isn't a politician in a tailored suit, reading scripted speeches written by foreign advisors. He is something different, something raw, something unexpected. A young soldier, barely in his mid-30s, who suddenly found himself thrust into the heart of Africa's political storms. Born in Burkina Faso, Traoré wasn't raised in luxury. His early life reflected the hardships of his people, struggles with poverty, uncertainty, and the constant shadow of instability. Those experiences shaped him. When others chased comfort, he chose service. When others pursued safe careers, he joined the military. Not for power, but because he believed the army was one of the few institutions where ordinary men could still fight for their homeland. Fast forward to 2022. Burkina Faso was drowning in crises. Terrorist groups ravaged villages, displacing thousands of families. Foreign companies exploited resources, gold, cotton, minerals, while ordinary citizens saw little benefit. Politicians promised change, but delivered nothing. And then came the breaking point. The government seemed powerless, even indifferent to the suffering of its people. Enter Traoré. He was just a captain at the time, not a general, not a senior commander. But sometimes history doesn't wait for rank. He led a group of soldiers who staged a coup, ousting the existing leadership. At first, many inside and outside Burkina Faso dismissed him. He's too young, critics said. He doesn't have the experience. But for many ordinary citizens, that was exactly the point. He wasn't part of the corrupt old guard. He wasn't weighed down by decades of failed politics. He was fresh blood. When Traoré first appeared on national television after taking power, people noticed something unusual. No teleprompter, no heavily polished speech. Just a soldier, speaking plainly, sometimes even emotionally, about what his country needed. He didn't sound like a politician. He sounded like a man tired of watching Burkina Faso suffer. That authenticity, rare in African politics, won him respect, but it also won him enemies. Foreign powers were suddenly uncomfortable. Here was a leader not afraid to question the aid packages, the agreements, the partnerships that often left Africa with empty hands and full debts. He started talking about sovereignty, about keeping Burkina Faso's resources for its own people. He cut ties with certain foreign military forces, refusing to let outsiders dictate security on Burkinabe's soil. He even looked to strengthen relationships with neighboring African nations instead of looking outward for approval. This made him a lightning rod. Some praised him as the face of a new, fearless Africa. Others painted him as a reckless populist who could isolate the country further. But one thing was certain. Traoré was no puppet. And this is where the story of the 57 trucks becomes so symbolic. Stopping them wasn't about suspicion, it was about principle. For Traoré, every action sends a message. By blocking that convoy, He wasn't just halting vehicles, he was halting the old way of doing things, where foreign goods entered without question, where leaders bowed to external pressure, where Africa's borders were open highways for exploitation. Who is Captain Traoré then? He is the kind of leader who believes in direct confrontation. He doesn't hide behind committees or endless paperwork. He acts. If something feels suspicious, he calls it out. If something feels unjust, he challenges it. And that attitude resonates with young Africans who see in him a reflection of their own frustrations, an impatience with corruption, with dependency, with leaders who smile abroad but fail at home. But don't mistake him for being a romantic hero. Traoré is also a man under immense pressure. Every move he makes is watched closely, every decision analyzed, every statement scrutinized. Running a country at war with itself and dealing with powerful, external interests is no easy task. He knows one mistake could weaken his credibility, not just inside Burkina Faso, but across the continent. That's why the standoff mattered so much. It wasn't about trucks. It was about demonstrating that Burkina Faso had a spine, that under Traoré, the country would no longer accept things blindly, and at that moment, standing under the burning sun, surrounded by soldiers and restless drivers, Traoré proved something essential about himself. He may be young, but he is not afraid. And that courage, whether you see it as boldness or recklessness, is what makes him one of the most fascinating leaders in Africa today. Because here's the truth. Africa has seen many leaders who rose with promises but bent under pressure. Traoré is trying to carve out a different path, one where Burkina Faso can stand tall, unshaken, even if the entire world is watching. That's who Captain Traoré is. A soldier, a symbol, a leader caught between immense hope and immense risk. And as the story of the trucks shows, his leadership style is clear. He will confront the unknown head-on, even if it means standing alone against forces far larger than himself. 57 trucks might seem like just a random number. After all, trucks cross borders in Africa every single day, but this convoy was different. Something about it felt off, and the symbolism of that number, neither too small to dismiss nor too large to ignore, turned it into a mystery that demanded answers. So let's slow down and picture the scene again. A lengthy line of 57 heavy trucks, their engines rumbling, their cargo sealed tight under heavy tarps, dust swirling around them in the hot border air. Drivers were sweating nervously as soldiers walked up and down the line, rifles in hand, scanning the vehicles. This wasn't just a normal border crossing. It was a moving question mark. What was inside? Why so many at once? And why now? To understand why Traoré and his men acted, you must look at history. In West Africa, borders have long been leaky gateways for everything from smuggled gold and weapons to questionable foreign goods. Sometimes aid shipments come disguised as humanitarian relief but end up serving political interests. Sometimes natural resources leave the continent hidden in unmarked trucks, enriching corporations while locals remain poor. So when 57 trucks suddenly appeared, the suspicion wasn't paranoia. It was grounded in a pattern. The number itself made it suspicious. 1 truck? Just a mistake. 5 trucks? Routine commerce. But 57? That's not commerce, that's a convoy. That's logistics. That's coordination. Someone organized many trucks to move together, and that raised red flags. Burkina Faso, under Traoré's leadership, has been trying to break free from dependency on external powers. And that means tightening borders, questioning imports, and demanding accountability. So, when 57 trucks rolled in, they represented more than cargo. They represented the possibility of hidden influence. Were they carrying supplies? Weapons? Resources being taken illegally? Or are even tools meant to destabilize the fragile balance of the nation? Here's where the story deepens. To the outside observer, a convoy of trucks is just transport. But in Africa, especially in regions where coups and conflicts have shaped politics, convoys often signal more than trade. They can signal pressure. They can signal power plays. They can signal the presence of foreign agendas wrapped in aid. And that's why stopping the trucks mattered. It wasn't about suspicion. It was about sending a message. By halting them, Traoré was declaring that Burkina Faso would not be a corridor for shadowy operations, no matter who was behind them. He was saying, "We decide what enters our land, not you." Think about the psychology of it. 57. Trucks lined up on a dusty road, each one a sealed container, each one a mystery. It created tension not only for the soldiers, but also for the public, who quickly heard about the incident. And once the story spread, people began to ask, what's inside those trucks? The number 57 became symbolic. To some, it represented the endless exploitation of Africa's borders. To others, it represented courage, the courage to stop something that looked too big to question. Because let's be honest, in the past, many leaders would have let the convoy pass without a second glance, fearing the consequences of upsetting powerful interests. Traoré didn't. He put a spotlight on it. And the irony is, it almost doesn't matter what the trucks carried. Whether they were harmless goods or something more sinister, the act of stopping them itself was revolutionary. Because the message was bigger than the cargo. Burkina Faso is no longer on autopilot. In African politics, gestures matter. Symbolic actions can sometimes carry more weight than actual policies. The 57 trucks became a symbol of sovereignty. It wasn't about paperwork, or customs or trade policy. It was about dignity, about refusing to be a silent participant in a game controlled by others. For ordinary Africans watching, that number, 57, stuck in their minds. It turned into a talking point in markets, in tea shops, on radio shows. Did you hear about the 57 trucks? What do you think was inside? The uncertainty made it powerful, almost legendary. It became less about facts and more about narrative. And in politics, narratives are everything. But let's not ignore the risks. Halting a convoy of that size wasn't just a bold move, it was a dangerous one. If those trucks were backed by foreign interests, then blocking them could invite retaliation. It could strain diplomatic ties, choke supplies, or even trigger economic pushbacks. Yet Traoré seemed willing to take that risk. That willingness to gamble, to place principle above fear, is what made the act so significant. So why 57 trucks? Because in that convoy, Traoré saw more than vehicles. He saw history repeating itself. He saw exploitation trying to sneak across the border. Business as usual, the same old story. And he decided, without delay, to flip the script. And that's why the world took notice. Not because 57 is a magical number, but because it became a symbol. A symbol of a small country saying no to forces bigger than itself. A symbol of leadership that dares to confront what others ignore. A symbol that sometimes sovereignty is evaluated not in grand speeches or international summits, but in dusty border checkpoints where 57 trucks wait in silence. The air was heavy. Dust clung to the skin, the sun pressed down like fire, and silence stretched across the border post, broken only by the low growl of truck engines left idling in the heat. 57 trucks stood in line, a convoy frozen in time. On one side, the soldiers of Burkina Faso, tense, rifles slung across their chests. On the other side, drivers who avoided eye contact, gripping their steering wheels as if holding on to secrets. This was not just a border checkpoint. It was a stage. And on that stage, two forces faced each other, suspicion and defiance. The soldiers moved deliberately, circling each truck like hunters sizing up their prey. They tapped on the steel containers with their rifles, listening to echoes for any hollow sound that might betray hidden cargo. They demanded papers, scrutinized them, and flipped them back and forth. The documents were there, yes, but something felt rehearsed, too neat, as if the convoy had been prepared for questioning. Still, the drivers remained calm, or at least tried to. Some lit cigarettes, the smoke curling into the stifling air. Others stared straight ahead, eyes locked on the horizon, pretending not to notice the soldiers' stares. Yet their nervous gestures, tapping fingers on steering wheels, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, betrayed the tension. This was more than a customs check. It was a standoff. The leader of the border unit, a captain loyal to Traoré, finally stepped forward. His boots crunched on the gravel as he raised his hand. "Nobody moves," he barked. His words cut through the heat like a blade. "These trucks will not pass until we know exactly what they carry." A murmur rippled through the drivers. Some protested in hushed tones, others cursed under their breath. One bold man, sweat dripping down his forehead, shouted, "We carry food, supplies for the people. Why stop us?" The captain's eyes narrowed. He had heard it before. Always food, always supplies, always a humanitarian excuse. But too many times he had seen what lay beneath those tarps. Weapons, propaganda materials, or resources stripped from African soil heading out under false names. He wasn't about to be fooled. The standoff dragged on. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the convoy. The trucks loomed like silent beasts in the twilight. Soldiers grew restless, tightening their grips on their rifles. The drivers grew anxious, some stepping out of their vehicles to plead with the guards. The air buzzed with unease, as if something were about to snap. It wasn't about cargo anymore, it was about pride. The soldiers represented sovereignty, a nation's right to question what entered its borders. The drivers, on the other hand, represented an operation bigger than themselves. They weren't just transporting goods, they were pawns in a larger game. And at that moment, everyone knew it. What made the scene electric was the uncertainty. Nobody really knew what was inside those trucks. The soldiers didn't know. The drivers weren't talking. The people nearby, gathering in small crowds, whispered. Theories, weapons, gold, foreign aid that comes with strings attached. Each rumor fueled the tension like sparks threatening to ignite. And then came the first act of defiance. One driver, his patience shattered, turned his ignition and inched forward as if daring the soldiers to stop him. The convoy roared louder, other engines revving in a wave of solidarity. Dust kicked up as the trucks threatened to push through. The captain's voice thundered, "Stop or we fire!" The words froze the moment. Soldiers raised their rifles, barrels glinting in the dying sunlight. The driver slammed his brakes, the screech echoing through the silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The standoff had reached its peak. This wasn't about a line of trucks anymore. It was about control, about whether Burkina Faso's will be bent under pressure, about whether sovereignty meant anything at all. And here is the striking part. Even though no bullets were fired, the image of those soldiers facing down 57 trucks carried as much weight as a battle. It showed resolve. It showed that Burkina Faso was no longer willing to be a silent corridor for hidden agendas. The standoff ended not with violence, but with immovable firmness. The trucks were held, detained for further inspection. And in that pause, that refusal to bow, the border checkpoint transformed into a symbol. For the soldiers, it was pride. For the drivers, it was humiliation. For the people watching, it was inspiration. And for the world, it was a message. Burkina Faso will not be crossed without question. The standoff would be remembered not for what was inside the trucks, but for the moment of defiance it represented. In the dusty borderlands where power is often invisible and exploitation moves in silence, this was a rare scene where sovereignty stood tall and visible, refusing to yield. Borders are not just lines on a map. They are scars, reminders, and sometimes weapons. They divide nations, yes, but they also tell stories of resistance, betrayal, struggle, and pride. At that dusty checkpoint between Burkina Faso and its neighbors, the 57 trucks and the soldiers who stopped them weren't just facing each other over goods. They were standing on the very idea of what a border means. For centuries, Africans never drew African borders. They were carved out by strangers, colonial masters sitting in faraway rooms with pens and rulers, splitting land without care for the people who lived on it. Rivers were cut in half, villages split down the middle, tribes and families torn apart. Those lines became borders. And when independence came, most of those borders remained, trapping nations inside cages built by others. That is why the symbolism of a border in Africa is heavy. It carries the weight of history. To control one's border is to reclaim dignity. To lose control is to be reminded of colonial subjugation all over again. When the soldiers of Burkina Faso blocked those trucks, they weren't just guarding a crossing point, they were making a statement. This land belongs to us. This soil will not be walked on without our permission. Our borders are not corridors for hidden agendas. That standoff became a moment where sovereignty was not just a word of speech, but an action. Borders also symbolize power. Nations without control over their borders are often seen as weak, vulnerable to foreign influence, smuggling, or exploitation. Borders are the skin of a country. If the skin is porous, infection enters. If it is strong, the body survives. By refusing passage, Burkina Faso was saying, "We will not be an open wound for others to bleed us dry." But borders are also psychological. To the drivers, the soldiers' defiance was not just an inconvenience. It was a message that their mission, whatever it truly was, had been exposed. They could no longer glide under the veil of legitimacy. The invisible wall of suspicion had turned solid. Their halted engines and idle trucks became proof that borders are not simply about geography, they are about identity and control. For the people of Burkina Faso, watching from the sidelines, the symbolism cut even deeper. Many of them had lived their entire lives feeling as though their country was small, fragile, dependent on foreign aid, always vulnerable to outside forces. Yet here at the border, their army, their sons, their brothers, stood like guardians. Suddenly, the border became not a line of division, but a wall of pride. It was proof that Burkina Faso could say no. This is why borders in Africa are never neutral. Every barrier, every gate, every crossing tells a story of who holds power. When those soldiers stood firm, they flipped the narrative from weakness to resistance. They turned a checkpoint into a battlefield of symbolism where sovereignty was tested and won. And beyond symbolism, borders are theaters of confrontation between the seen and the unseen. What passes through them often shapes the fate of nations, resources, weapons, propaganda, even ideology. Control the border, and you control the flow of influence. Lose the border, and you invite chaos. Think about it. 57 trucks, on paper just cargo, but potential careers of a foreign agenda. If those trucks had passed unnoticed, whatever they carried, be it weapons, supplies for destabilization, or propaganda, would have slipped into the country like poison in the bloodstream. Stopping them was more than an act of logistics. It was an act of survival. Borders also evaluate alliances. If Burkina Faso's soldiers had stepped aside, the people would have questioned their loyalty. Were they serving their nation or bowing to external experts? By drawing the line, at the line, they reminded the world that allegiance lies first with the soil beneath their boots. At the same time, borders are mirrors. They reflect not only the strength of the nation that guards them, but also the desperation of those who try to cross them. The convoy's pushback, their engines revving in protest, revealed that something bigger than humanitarian cargo was at stake. If it were truly just food and supplies, there would have been no need for such defiance. The border exposed truth in its rawest form, and this is the greatest symbolism of borders. They are the last defense of truth. Lies may travel far, hidden, under paperwork and polished speeches, but when they meet the border, they must face scrutiny. At that line, truth truth and deception collide, and whichever side yields reveal reality. For Burkina Faso, the border confrontation became a microcosm of a larger struggle, Africa's fight to define itself against external powers. To say, our borders are not for sale, our land is not for plunder, our sovereignty is not negotiable. When future generations recall this moment, they may not remember the exact date or the names of the drivers, but they will remember the image. 57 trucks held still by the will of a nation that refused to be crossed. That is the enduring power of borders. They turn fleeting events into lasting symbols. And so, in the silence after the standoff, when engines cooled and rifles lowered, the border itself had spoken. It whispered to the people, "Here is where we stand. Here is where we protect what ours is. Here is where Burkina Faso begins, and where outside influence ends." If this story moved you, imagine how many more voices are waiting to be heard. Don't miss the next one. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell icon so you're always with us when the truth unfolds.